Well, it's about time, so why don't we get started? Feel free to keep eating. One of the things that we're going to do is, those of you who have your phones, which I assume is everyone, are actually going to use your phone for two brief things. I wanted to start a little bit by hearing from you about leaders that you consider who are worthy of respect. So what this is, you can scan this QR code. You're going to be joining an online live poll, so I'm going to get your responses. Everybody's going to see it, so be mindful of making jokes. So our first question is that we're going to do is, I want you guys to text in to that phone number, that 22333, text in a leader that you respect. It could be a historical figure, a real person, somebody that you think, Alexander the Great, George Washington. Let's see, these things are coming up. We've got Dave Van Wagner's on there. Good job, Dave. We've got, let's see, a dad. Let's see, Powell. Wilson. Steve Powell's in there. So the bigger it is, the more commonly it's listed. Terry's on there. Apparently, someone named Dustin made the cut. All right. So feel free to add to this. I think that there are lots of different ways to think about leaders, lots of different examples. But what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what makes leaders who they are, and then how they fit within organizations. So I have a little bit of an agenda here that will go through these 5 areas. So we're going to talk about positions that are supervisors, managers, and directors. We're going to talk about the structure of organizations and how those roles fit in those organizations. Considerations when you're looking at transitioning roles through organizations, skills of those positions, and then resources that I think. So, what I want to start with is, overall, you could break down organizations into kind of 6 levels. Starting at the front line, these are people who are literally on the front line doing the work day in and day out. You move up to leads, which tend to be similar to frontline, but generally the most experienced ones. Then supervisors, managers, directors, and CEOs. And again, I did not frame this specifically with Wasatch County in mind, just kind of more generally how these things work. Now, this presentation is going to focus on these 3, which are kind of the middle management portion of this, and that they have different roles. But I think something that we also need to address is that there is, I think, a stereotypical view of managers as, like, not great, right? Like, they can be intimidating, they can be unresponsive, that I think there are, if you think about social media and media in general, it's a lot more common to find examples of bad bosses than good ones, right? Michael Scott, I think of a David Palmer. Who knows who David Palmer is? Anybody?
The president.
President of the best president the United States has ever had, from show 24 with Jack Bauer. Great leader. Anyone know this guy? Office Space. Not a great boss. But Jack Donaghy, I think, is actually a great example of a boss. He was pretty supportive. So this is from 30 Rock. Supported Liz Lemon pretty well. Tried to buffer her from corporate, things like that. But I think the difference that separates the leaders that you all mentioned, some of the bad examples and the good examples, are two things. One is this paradigm here, power over versus leading through. Power over paradigm is what you might think of typically when you think of, like, a boss. Right? They're telling you have to do this. They're exerting power over you to get you to do something. I think that is not a great management style. It's not great for employees. It's not good for anyone. And leading through is the preferable approach, which means that you bring people along with you as you lead through issues. You don't push someone into it, you deal with it. And this concept of transactional versus transformational, this is in the context of relationships. And this applies in many more contexts than just supervision and management. But a lot of relationships can be transactional in that you're trying to get what you can out of that relationship. It's a transaction I want X, you want Y, and we're going to fight over or negotiate or whatever. I think a better approach is a transformational approach, which is what can I bring to this relationship and how can it be a mutually beneficial experience? And I think that both of these deal with, in leadership specifically, of leaders, our jobs are to help get things out of organizations and out of employees. The way that you approach them can make a really big difference for everyone's experience. So what I'm going to go through is some definitions of what these positions are, because you'll hear me refer to it, and in general, it's like a manager or a supervisor can be kind of an amorphous thing, right? Of like, a manager could just be a boss, right? A supervisor could just be a boss. But for the purposes of our discussion and how I'm going to frame it, we're going to use these definitions. So a supervisor is management directing the work of frontline and lead employees. So this is low-level management. They're primarily responsible for these types of things: training new employees, focusing on individual employee performance, and then making recommendations on employment actions. That means not having the authority to execute employment actions. That would be promotions or hiring, firing, things like that. They typically report to a manager. This supervisor will engage on, hey, we have very specific tasks that need to be done, and then who is doing it, and how do we make sure that they're doing it right? Okay. A manager is management overseeing the use of resources, outputs of teams. So this is a higher level. It's mid-management. They're responsible for hiring, promoting, and firing staff. They focus on processes and short-term planning. Okay. Managers will report to a director. And directors are senior managers who are accountable for overall success or failure. Right? So they have a focus on strategy. They're top-level management. They establish organizational goals and priorities. They assemble and allocate resources. They focus on external interactions. And those external could be relative to that director's purview, could be still internal to an organization, but across other aspects of that organization, or to entirely different organizations. They typically report to a chief executive officer, or CEO. We talked a little bit about these 6 different levels and who works with whom. So as a CEO, typically they'll generally work about 2 levels down. This is in a kind of an ideal circumstance. Okay, we're going to get into a little bit of this. So a CEO will work with directors and managers over, again, high-level issues, and typically will not get involved in a whole lot lower ones. And same thing with directors dealing with supervisors, managers dealing with leads, supervisors and leads dealing with frontline staff. That's part of why I bring this up, is because what role you fill, you're going to have some overlap with those duties. And again, this is maybe an ideal scenario, but I have, for instance, I'm the CEO of Wasatch County. I have frontline staff that work for me, right? So I'm responsible for managing them directly, and I'm responsible for their individual performance. You might say, well, that's kind of what I defined a supervisor as doing, but the reality is that there are no clear lines here, that you need to have abilities to do things across those organizations, basically as your position, as the organization permits. Also, most organizations don't really look like this. Maybe you're in a department where you don't have a lead, there's just some frontline staff. Or maybe there's not a supervisor, there are managers over that. Or maybe you're in a department where you're a department director and there's just you and some staff, right? All of these things still work. They are still good. This is, again, just an ideal outline. But I think many of the things we're going to talk about today will still apply even in circumstances like this. So, we're going to do a little activity. This is focusing on Parks and Recreation. So raise your hand if you are not familiar with Parks and Recreation. Okay, get in a group with people who are familiar with Parks and Recreation. We're going to talk about these characters based on the definitions that I gave you, which one do they fill, okay? So form a group, like each table will be a group, okay? So you should have some. We're going to take 3 minutes. I'm going to set a timer. 3 minutes to go. Talk about who these people are and which people they fill. What we're going to do is we're going to go through one by one. And okay, so who knows who this character is over here? Ron Swanson. What's Ron's title? Anybody? He's the director of Parks and Recreation. That's a little bit of a giveaway in that Ron is a director level here, okay? So Leslie Nope works for Ron Any idea what role she fills?
She's the CEO.
Manager.
So she is actually the manager. She's the assistant director. She is over parks, and so part of the show is about her ability to build a park. This guy is only in like 3 episodes.
That's the curveball.
Yeah, so he's a curveball. His name is Paul Ioresco. That's the character's name. And he is the city manager. He's the one at the very beginning of the show. The premise is that Leslie's trying to build a park, and it's like, no, never gonna happen. Paul says, fast track this. So Paul is the city manager. This is Tom Haverford. He's a frontline employee, and then later this season, or series, this is Craig Middlebrooks, who becomes, he's an associate director. So we're gonna do one more. We're gonna talk. We're gonna do Office. Okay. So you should be more familiar with these ones. Okay. Go ahead and take just 1 minute. Think through who fills which role. Okay. And again, we're gonna go left to right. Characters from this way to that. It's the beginning of the show. So the beginning of the show is a frontline employee. Daryl. He's the supervisor in the warehouse. Right. He has crews that work for him. Jan is a director. She's actually the VP of sales. And this is kind of a cheat in that his name's David Wallace, but he's actually not the CEO. He's the but there isn't a CEO of the show, so I cheat. Parks and Recreation, Office, probably not ideal examples of leadership. There are flaws, but I think there's some truth to the depictions that they have of leadership, of politics within workspace. And so what I'm hoping to do is that as we talk about what the roles of specifically these 3 positions have, how they can help avoid some of these problems. Also, if you're curious, watch Parks and Recreation. I am Ben Wyatt. Okay, so you ask me later. Okay, we're going to talk about transitioning roles. So this is specifically as you move either within an organization or across organizations. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what things you should consider and things that might impact your decision, ability, interest in transitioning up and through some of these roles, okay? Who's familiar with the Peter Principle? Anybody? So this is
Like the Bible or no?
Terry.
Maybe I should leave.
That's all right.
I think the Peter Principle is where it's just like the next guy in line.
Yeah. So it's like the next guy in line. You promote somebody. So there is a book called Principle. It was published in the 80s. It observes that people in a hierarchy tend to rise to the level of their incompetence. In that you hire someone because they're the best at sales to be the manager over sales, a la Michael Scott, but he's incompetent, right? Because you hired him because he was the best salesman. He's clearly not the best manager. And so this is a principle, and there's like lots of literature on whether or not this is true or organizations like intentionally follow this. And generally there's like a weak consensus that this is kind of true, and that sometimes people get hired for reasons that aren't very well aligned with what the new position is. Right? You have an architect who's a great architect, gets hired to manage other architects, doesn't know how to manage architects. Right? All of those things. Something that you need to keep in mind as well is that as you, and we talked about a little bit of this, as the definition of those positions rise through an organization, the responsibilities and needs change, right? When you're on the front line, you're doing the work, you're becoming a subject matter expert, but the higher up an organization goes, the less you are involved in those subject matter expert areas and the more abstract the issues become. And whether or not that is of interest to you is important for you to consider if you are interested in progressing to the levels, because you'll be dealing with very different things. Sometimes that's good. I'm peak millennial. I love new, interesting challenges, and so I like trying new things, and that's part of what excites me about the job that I do now. I want to talk a little bit about what role education plays. Do you need a management degree? Do you need a degree period? I think there are 2 main things that education does for you. They are signaling and exposure. signaling in that I think an education degree is most useful when you are leaving one organization and going to another, because you are sending a signal that I have independent verification that I have reached some level of competence within a given subject area. I think that's less important if you intend to stay within an individual organization, because it's easier to see if someone has the right skills and mindset when you have experience working with them. If you're interviewing outside of an organization, I don't know if any of you have been involved in interviews. How many of you have been involved in interviews? Some of you have. It's very difficult to, both as an interviewee and as an interviewer, to get at like the meat of, like, is someone going to be a good fit? Do they have the skills to do the things that we need to do? And there's just so many different facets of it that education can fill one of those roles. And I think honestly, I would not have this job if I did not have a master's degree. I could have been the exact same candidate, exact same qualifications, been in the same position. If I did not have my MBA, I would not have been as committed to this job. So I think I'll get to the second point, but it kind of just filled that signaling role of, I tick the box of I have a certification. And that just raises your ability to get those types of jobs. Exposure is, I think, what the material benefit of an education is, in that you get exposure to things that you wouldn't normally otherwise. This is a good thing to consider, especially if you're a longtime person in an organization. You may only be familiar with how that organization works. Maybe you've only ever had one boss, and maybe it's Michael Scott. That's been your one boss, right? Maybe you haven't had great role models, and by getting an education, you get exposure to different ideas, best practices. You're going to learn things, right? That's what this is, and that's kind of the intent. I did learn things in my master's degree. I think that those helped make me qualified. But I think those are almost independent aspects, because someone can get a degree and not learn something. And you can get a degree and learn something from it. Ultimately, a lot of those things come from how well you internalize the lessons that you had. And that could be within the organization or within an education. So I would say, no, I don't think degrees are absolutely necessary. I think they help. I think especially if you're looking at two candidates who are otherwise identical, one has a degree and one doesn't, we're going to pick the one that on the paper has that extra certification. So just keep that in mind. I think in general in interviewing is probably a whole set of skills that maybe we should talk about at some point, but being able to convey your ability to do something outside of your experience is critical in those types of interviews, right? If you want to move from, say, a frontline staff member to a supervisor, that's a change, right? Like I said, we don't want you to have the Peter principle of you're not qualified. Being able to understand what those issues are, talk about what those issues, and acknowledge even your own deficiencies. I talked with someone who used to work at the county who is now an assistant city manager out east, and about his interview process. I told him specifically, like, don't try to hide the fact that you don't have experience. Acknowledge that you have untapped potential. And I think that's the best perspective to take when you're looking at changing your position to a new role with very different responsibilities. Talk about the ways in which you can meet those new, and acknowledge that you know that they are different and that you don't necessarily have that experience. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my own experience, okay? So indulge me for a minute. I'm gonna go through my career as brief as it is. I've only been working for a little over 11 years. So I started kind of my career, I got my Master of Public Administration at BYU, and during that time I did an internship in Provo City. I worked in the mayor's office. I worked with the chief administrative officer because Provo is a strong mayor form of government. They have a chief executive that's elected. That was at the time who is now Congressman Curtis, who was the mayor of Provo. And then I worked with his chief administrative officer. His name is Wayne Parker, and it was a phenomenal experience. I got to do some really great things, but it was an internship. I wasn't expecting, I'm not from Utah, I grew up in Texas, and I was like, oh, this is just, like it's a year-long internship, so I was just going to do as far as my master's program. But then I got a job at Provo. One of the projects I did, I worked for the power department. They had an opening for an analyst position, and I got that job. I was not excited about it. I was like, from Utah? Really? Like, I grew up in Texas. Texas is way cooler, right? Objectively. But no, I realized that I had such a good experience that I think there was value in me staying in an organization that knew what I was capable of. So I was an analyst in Provo for about 2 years. Then I switched over, and actually, while I was an analyst, I had a Master of Administration. I told my boss that actually I wanted supervisory experience, so he assigned an administrative assistant to report to me. So from the beginning of my career, I had some experience managing staff. He was a great employee. I never had to do anything other than just check in with her and fill out annual appraisal forms, right? I also didn't have a lot of experience doing anything more than that, which really there is more. So I actually moved over. I was approached by the finance department to come over and become an accountant. I don't have an accounting degree. I have my undergraduate is in economics. But I'm comfortable with spreadsheets, so that's a little bit of a spoiler. So I have these spreadsheet withdrawals, right? I'm really good with spreadsheets. I had some technology background. I figured I could learn what I needed to do. I was the accountant for about 8 months before becoming the budget officer controller at Provo. Again, not an accountant, but it was a really good opportunity. I spoke with the CAO, and he was like, yeah, this is a great opportunity for your career path to ultimately becoming a city manager, which was what my goal was. And so I became the budget officer. I did that for a little over 3 years before coming to Wasatch County as the assistant county manager. I was Mike's assistant county manager for about 2 years now as the county manager. So my experience was I started out here, I was kind of a frontline staff, even though on paper I was a manager, right? When I was an accountant, I actually took a step back. I had no one reporting to me. It was better experience. I had more exposure across the organization because I was doing financial analysis for all of the city. I was dealing with police and fire and HR and all these other things. And then as the budget officer, I actually had a lot more exposure dealing kind of in the room with more important issues. But when I became an assistant county manager, that's when things really changed. So these jobs were very technical in nature. I knew what I needed to do. My NPA really well qualified me for those jobs in that I knew how to do analysis and communicate it and write it and do all of those things. But becoming the assistant county manager here at Wasatch County, I had spreadsheet withdrawals, right? Like I was no longer doing the thing that I was good at, that I had done for 6 years, that was most comfortable in my wheelhouse. And I knew that this time was coming, right? You always think about transition when you go through this process of transitioning through roles. But it was difficult because I changed from I made a thing to I'm helping someone else make a thing. And that's kind of a mindset I struggled a little bit with, like, how do I feel productive? How do I know if I'm being effective? And those are things to keep in mind, that as you progress through an organization, the way in which you manage or measure your success changes over the course of your career. So I want to talk a little bit about key skills. These are things that I think, these are my opinions, but I want to do another word cloud. So I want to go back to your phones. We're going to do another word cloud, and we're going to talk about what are skills that you think are important or necessary for being a supervisor, manager, or director. So biggest things that we see consistently, so the bigger it is, the more times you all have mentioned it: communication, empathy, understanding. Those are the highest ranked things, if you will, on this. You can see others: example, appetite, willing, work, trust, leading, transparency, willingness to change, approachable. I said that one already. Okay. So I think these are all really good things, and we actually think a lot alike, because I'm going to go through, I'm going to start with number one. Number one is what I put is communication. I think effective communication is so clearly the most important attribute of any managerial role. And honestly, any position, whether what you're in now, being able to communicate in a way that clearly identifies issues and talks about issues. I mean, in any context, even outside your professional life, like this is just so important. So I've got a few key elements, right? So there are elements to what makes an effective communicator. Active listening. You must listen to employees in context, feedback, ideas, concerns. You need to be very clear, communicate in a very straightforward manner. A lot of people in your family of origin may have grown up with tendencies to imply things or encourage people to read subtext. Do away with all of that. My wife and I, we practice what we have come to appreciate as content communication. I tell all my directors, some of them are in here, that like, mean what you say what you mean, right? Like, don't make anyone read to it. If I'm not telling you it's a problem, you can safely assume it's not a problem, right? If you are a supervisor, practice that. Talk to people about, hey, if we got an issue, talk about it. Like, that's the only way you're gonna resolve it. Far too often it's easy to just avoid things instead of talking about them. And I think if you were to instead address them before they become major issues, you could work through them. And that's really for everyone's benefit. I think it's important to be adaptable because even if you're the best content communicator in the world, the other person may not, right? So you have to be able to read people and communicate with them. And you also have to be able to give constructive feedback. We have had some other sessions kind of talking about how to do some of those things. So we're not going to dive too much into the specifics of these skills. Number 2, emotional intelligence. So we talked about many of the things on that list fall under what I would clarify as emotional intelligence, right? So this is your ability to understand and empathize with people. I think it includes a lot of self-awareness. Being a manager is not always easy, and like we all acknowledge, we have lives outside of our professional lives, and being able to be self-aware enough of like, are you in a good spot when you're having difficult conversations, have a big impact on it. Being able to self-regulate and not lashing out at people, I think is important. Having empathy and understanding other people. I think this is so important in so many ways, for customer service, for communication, for so many reasons. Being able to just appreciate that other people have good reasons for saying and doing the things that they do, even if you don't agree with those reasons, they're doing them because they feel like they have reasons for them. And social skills, just kind of in general, making sure that you can communicate with people the way that they like to communicate. So number 3, we're gonna talk about decision-making and problem solving. I think this one is a little bit different in that what the specifics of this change as your role changes, but having analytical thinking, having creativity, decisiveness, and risk management are all skills that are important at any level of a career. But what you have to have analytical thinking about or creativity about changes as your role changes. Like a director, like Terry, he has to think about not the technical aspects of operating equipment or making sure that we do kind of construction things in the most detailed way, but a higher level strategy, knowing what those things are. This is, I think, one area in which education can help. A big one is decisiveness too. It can be very tempting to push off decision making and not commit. Good leaders, I think, take in input and then make decisions and march forward. And then number 4, delegation and time management. I think these are important skills. So being able to understand who can do what, being able to give clear instructions to people, trusting people to do the things you ask them to do, I think is really critical, as well as knowing how to prioritize things. I think in many of our lives, and especially I feel like in Wasatch County, we have to do all of the things all at once. There's a lot of pressure to get it all done. But being able to prioritize it as a leader and saying, no, these are the most important things. Recognizing that means that some other things are going to suffer is important. Trust is really critical in that I think it comes back to communication skills, but being able to trust other people and to trust that even if they do it differently than you, or maybe even not as good as you would do it, that you can trust that they can do good work too. For instance, like I love digging in spreadsheets. I haven't done it in a while, and while maybe I think, oh, I could do that better, I trust my employees enough that I don't feel the need to get in and meddle with their things. Just let it be what it is. And the last one is about coaching and development. I think being able to work with employees is probably one of the hardest aspects of management. Because, let's talk a couple of these things. So mentorship, being able to help employees, guide them through professional growth, career development, I think is a valuable aspect. Again, that speaks to that transformation relationship. I feel like I'm talking about this in abstract because while I want all of you to stay at Wasatch County, I also want you to be the best possible employees if you choose to go somewhere else. I think that relationship makes us both better. Right? Having that same approach with your direct reports can make a difference. Providing training opportunities. I think the county, we are doing this, we are doing other things to try and provide additional training opportunities. Being able to set goals is really important, measuring those goals, and being able to know when and how to effectively recognize people is important. But I think one of the hardest things about job is it's relatively easy to deal with a very bad employee. Because I feel like I have a lot of empathy and it can be difficult to have tough conversations. But when there is a really objective basis for that conversation of like, crashed a car, like, that's not something we can debate about, right? Like, that's pretty easy to go through and like address an employment situation like that. Or someone's a rock star. It's just like, keep doing it, man. You know, you're doing great. Like, you can encourage them, you can set goals and things like that. What is hard is people who are in the middle who maybe you just need a little bit more out of, and having skills that can help them coach and develop and say, hey, how do we inspire you to do a little more, be a little better? I think it's really important skill. So this brings me back a little bit to my own experience in that there were many things along this way that even though I talked about how I had, it's a very different career shift when I went from one to the other. So as a budget officer, I had like 4 employees who reported to me, and I dealt with a couple minor disciplinary actions that were not like kind of big deals. But I do have some experiences that, like, you think, oh, this is all management stuff. But actually, one of the ones that stands out most, I have a little bit of funny story to tell with this picture. So this is a picture of a Provo City Council meeting. And the context of this is that I was the budget officer at the time. So I had experience presenting to the City Council our annual budget process. So we present a tentative budget in May, it's one of the year, we present the final budget in June. And at the June meeting, this person here is the chair of the council, really butted heads with this person here, who's the mayor, Congressman Curtis. And they had this like shadow war thing going on. They were fighting over different stuff. So at this public hearing, this council member, along with a couple of her faction, kind of ambushed me and said, hey, what's up with the mayor's budget? We think it's too big. And, you know, like raised all these concerns. And I felt like that was a really great experience for me to be able to respond in my area of expertise, but in a way that I got exposure to issues that were beyond, because I was just doing the numbers, right? Like, I don't tell the mayor you can or can't have this budget, but I was able to, I think, say with credibility and confidence of that, no, this is the same process we use for all of these things, and relying on the technical side, that my technical background is still useful, and your technical background will always be. But, so when I go to conferences for like city and county managers, there are people from every background. There are public works people, there are public safety people, there are IT people, there are recreation people. Actually, the new CAO of Provo, the previous manager, Wayne Parker, retired. The Parks and Recreation Director is now the CAO. And so there's a lot of different experiences that you can have that still apply when you get into these other kinds of roles. So I want to talk and end a little bit on resources. These are things that I've researched about specifically that I think you might be interested in if you're interested in management topics. So I've got these here, and they're in no particular order, but I think these things are all worth studying. So Crucial Conversations is about having difficult conversations with people under high stress circumstances. It's got very practical skills. You can see it's got a bunch of authors because it's written by professors and they all collaborate on things. I think that one's really, really helpful. Good to Great by Jim Collins, you probably have heard of it, but I think it's a good way of a framework of looking at how you and organizations can progress beyond just adequate. How You Measure Life by Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen is a professor. He worked for Harvard Business School, and this book is actually kind of a little bit of like a survey of all of his work. So that's why I'm recommending this one, because it touches on a bunch of different subjects. The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni talks about the advantages of highly effective executive teams. This one I found both very helpful and interesting, but also only partially applicable because it has some focus on the private sector issues that we just don't deal with here. Start with Why by Simon Sinek, which I It's a little bit self-explanatory. It talks about how approaches of managers can affect why organizations do the things they do and what makes the difference between highly effective organizations and less ones. And Turn the Ship Around by L. David Marquette is about it's ranked, but he became the captain of a submarine that was the lowest performing submarine in 12 months, made it the highest performing submarine. He talks specifically about a leader framework about how do you empower employees. So that's all I have for you. What questions, if any, do you all have about managers, supervisors, and